Hi, my name is Becky Prichard. I am here today with the literature review to review a great book by the author Taylor Caldwell. The book is entitled Dear and Glorious Physician. This is a story about St. Luke, the writer of one of our Gospels. So I have to admit that when I picked up this book for the very first time, I felt a little overwhelmed by the length and the premise of the book. In fact, it was right after I came back from maternity leave at the beginning of 2020, and I was scheduled to do the book review in April, and I got the book and I was ready to read, and I suddenly got a little overwhelmed with the size of it. And then we ran into COVID, and it was canceled. So I kind of had a breath of relief as I knew that I could delay a little bit longer and be able to read the rest of the book. I guess that is one good thing that came from COVID, is that it allowed me a little bit more time to read this great book. I'm typically a fan of historical fiction, but this book seemed daunting to me from the outset. However, I could not be more surprised by how engaged and engrossed I became in the book. What an interesting novel about St. Luke, and how it puts our knowledge of the Gospel of Luke into perspective when we see the way that Luke's life is illustrated by Caldwell in this book. Taylor Caldwell begins in the foreword by talking about her own intrigue with the Gospel writer St. Luke, and how she was fascinated by him for the fact that he was the only non-Jewish gospel writer, and that he never actually met Jesus while on this earth. Interesting, right? In addition, his entire gospel, Luke's entire gospel, was written from hearsay, and his time spent with many of the people who lived and walked with Jesus. So the fact that there are so many different perspectives that he gains from so many different types of people that encounter Jesus, and then that is illustrated in his gospel, is so fascinating. And the way that Caldwell explains that in this book is very intriguing and engrossing. Caldwell so eloquently sums up the book in the foreword at the very beginning when she says, "So the story of Lukanus, or St. Luke, is the story of every man's pilgrimage through despair and life darkness, through suffering and anguish, through bitterness and sorrow, through doubt and cynicism, through rebellion and hopelessness, to the feet and the understanding of God." She goes on to say that this search for God and the final revelation are the only meaning in life for me. Wow. It's a powerful foreword as she sets up her call to write this book, and really addresses the human condition in so many of the ways that this idea of every man's pilgrimage through all of these hard things on this earth. As a follower of Christ, this book struck deeply with me as I followed Lukanus on his journey to discover Christ in his own way and time, as he heard the stories told of the Messias. Fascinating that Taylor Caldwell is so intrigued by St. Luke. And at the outset, before I'd read this book, I don't know that I had given much thought to the writer of our gospel, Luke. But now that I have, and now that I've read this story, I too am as intrigued as Taylor Caldwell. So before we begin talking about the book itself, let's take a brief minute to talk about the author, Taylor Caldwell. Also, her name is Janet Miriam Holland Taylor Caldwell. That's a lot of names. Or she's better known as Taylor Caldwell. She also has written under a couple of other pen names: Marcus Holland, Max Reiner, and J. Miriam Reback, which is her married name. Caldwell was a British-born American novelist of popular fiction, and she and her family moved to the United States after she was born, when she was about 7 or 8 years old. She was born in 1900, and she died at the age of 84 in 1985. Much of her writing was based on real historical events or persons, and many of her writings dealt with religious themes, which is so interesting, this book specifically about the gospel writer St. Luke. Her books were often very big sellers, and she even won a few awards for some of her books throughout the years, all the way up until her death. Really, she was writing and publishing books. One interesting fact that I found noteworthy about Taylor Caldwell was that many presumed her to be a man, and it created some public stir when she was revealed to be a woman. And I find that fascinating because the name Taylor Caldwell is, a gender neutral name in a lot of ways. Taylor can be a boy or a girl. And knowing that her real name is Janet Miriam, I find that fascinating. So I'm curious what the stir was, possibly when people realized that she was actually a woman and people had assumed she was a male. For this particular book, Caldwell said it took her about 46 years to research and write. 46 years. You realize I'm only 35 years old. So to think about my whole lifetime plus 11 more years, that is a long time to be researching and writing and discovering how you're going to write this book. That shows commitment to the subject, and it really reflects upon her intrigue with St. Luke himself and why she was committed to this text and how she really wanted to do it justice by doing the correct research. And she says that it wasn't fully complete until she and her husband visited the Holy Land in 1956. So she even begins in the foreword talking about how this book started when she was what did she say, 12 years old. And throughout her whole childhood and adult life, she spent researching and discovering this book. I can only imagine for her when she completed this text, what a relief it would have been to have done all this research and then to have actually traveled to the Holy Land and been in the footsteps not only of Jesus, but also as she discovered where where Lukanus went to meet different people and learn about the life of Jesus and how his eyes were opened to the Messias and the Savior. And I'm sure for her, it was very gratifying to do the research, to have dreamed up the book a long time ago, and then to finally have fulfilled the mission and completed the book. So I find it a great effort that she gave, and I'm grateful to have read this book. After reading the book, you can see just how much time and energy she spent into illustrating the characters and following St. Luke as he grows up and begins to seek after the Messias. This is a story of love. It's a story of loss and grief, but it's also a story of hope. And as she writes in her foreword about the human journey, the pilgrimage of despair and darkness, and sorrow and grief and bitterness and anger, but leading to the feet of God, to the understanding of God. How much so is it for us living in this broken world, living in the despair of sin, but we are led on our journey to the feet of God, to the understanding of God. And that's why this story is so powerful, because as you follow Lukanus in his life, you see how God had him from the very beginning, an inherent faith that he had in God that grew and changed as he met different people, as he experienced life on this earth, as he lost many of his close relatives and friends and loved ones to death, and how he was powerfully engaged in who God was as his eyes were opened to the Messiah. The entire human condition is captured by Caldwell as she describes the life of Lukanus from a very young age. We know from the first couple of chapters that Lukanus was the son of a freed slave, Aeneas, who worked for the noble Roman soldier Diodorus. Aeneas and Diodorus had grown up together under Diodorus's father Priscus, and Lukanus was a Greek and not a Jew. And that's important to note because, again, he's the only gospel writer that was a Greek, and his upbringing and his heritage would have not taught him about Jewish tradition and about the unknown God. Yet, from a young age, he was curious and connected to the unknown God. He had an inherent faith in this unknown God, as he calls the Jewish God, that guided him rather than worshiping the many Greek gods of the day that were in his face, that he could have worshipped and sold out to culturally. However, he had this inherent faith. On page 17, Lukanus is talking to Diodorus about the unknown God and describes him this way. Lukanus says, "But the unknown God is the God of all men," said Lukanus earnestly. "He is the God not only of the Jews, but of the Romans and the Greeks and the pagans and of slaves and Caesars and of wild men in the forests and in the lands yet unknown." Wow. I mean, that is for a 12-year-old boy to say about a God that he didn't really know by tradition or culture. I think it's really cool that Caldwell illustrates it that way. God not only of the Jews, but of the Romans and of the Greeks and of the pagans, and God of all. And then he said, when he's asked how he knows this, when Diodorus asks, "Well, how do you know this, Lucanus?" Lucanus responds with, I know it in my heart. No one has told me." That is a powerful God. And you read these words and you say, wow, already God is at work in Lucanus's life. And it's a foreshadow of what is to come as Lukanus is going to journey through many hardships, and finally his eyes will be opened to the great mystery of God. Lukanus goes on to say that in his life, he will hear the unknown God's voice, and he shall know the unknown God. He shall serve him and give his heart and his life to him. So even though, as we read on, we know that Lukanus resists God in a lot of ways, and he tries to justify with reason explanations for what is happening in the world around him. It couldn't possibly be God. It couldn't possibly be miracles, because we know by certainty and reason it can't be. But from a young age, he knows that he's going to serve this God. God is at work in his life. Lukanus had a faith in a God that he wasn't taught about. It's interesting, right? How many of us grew up being taught about the God that we worship today? Lukanus was not taught about this God. Nobody told him to worship this God. He didn't have a family that practiced the Jewish traditions and studied the Jewish law and followed after the Jewish God, the God of the Israelites. He had a family that was Greek, and he was born to slaves, and he didn't have a weekly worship the same way that the Jewish people did. Yet he had a faith in a God that he didn't know. His groundwork is helpful to know, because throughout the book we see God is working in and through Lukanus and draws him to himself. And that is so true of the God that we worship, right? That God draws us to himself through our lives in different ways and through different people. And as Caldwell develops the characters in the story, the characters that surround Lukanus, that are pointing him to God and to Jesus Christ as the Messiah, it's amazing how God works through the people around him and the experiences that he faces. And same in our own lives. And that's why this story, this historical fiction story is so powerful for us as followers of Christ, because God is at work in our lives. And what are the different, I guess Mitchell Moore calls them Red Sea moments, where God is present with us and our eyes are open to the way he's been working in our lives. It's powerful story. And then to see the words of Luke that we read in our gospel, and to see how, wow, all of these influences and all the ways that he knew about Jesus, that he articulated them so well in his gospel. So as we turn back to the story, we see that for so long, Lukanus resisted the call of God. He tries to, like I said before, rationalize and explain by science or reason or logic how God can't exist, or he's angry with God because of the way that God took away his playmate, his young friend Rubria, at a young age. And he was so angry with God. He resisted the urge to give himself over to God and follow after God fully. Lukanus is a bright young boy. We know that Diodorus saw something in him. Diodorus commits to teaching him, to training him up, along with his own daughter Rubria, Lucanus's playmate, Diodorus's daughter, that they might be trained together and learn together by a tutor, even though Luke is just the son of a freed slave. But then he commits to sending him to become a physician, training him up to be a physician, to walk alongside Diodorus's own physician, and sending him to Alexandria to learn from other great physicians. This is a great commitment by Diodorus for this young boy Lucanus. He sees something in Lucanus that's great, and he fosters a great education for him. As we see throughout the book, we see that there are several relationships that Lucanus has throughout his life that are really deep love relationships. First with his playmate Rubria, Diodorus's young daughter. They're playmates, they grow up together, they study together. Rubria is ill and she almost dies at one point, and Lucanus prays out to the unknown God and asks for him to save her, and she recovers and lives a bit longer, only later to die. And how devastated and crushed Lucanus was when Rubria dies. He can't stand to lose her. And then he loves way later on in the book, he falls in love with Sarah ben Eleazar, and as the daughter of one who died, and he says that she is like his mother, as beautiful as his mother Iris. Iris is an interesting character in this book because Iris was married to his father Aeneas, but Iris grew up with Diodorus, and Diodorus was always in love with Iris, Luke's mother. And when Aeneas dies, Luke's dad dies, Diodorus has another baby with his wife Aurelia, and then when Aurelia dies, Diodorus commits Iris to raise his new babies, and they get together. So Diodorus becomes Lucanus's stepdad. So there's this beautiful tale of the love that Lucanus has for women in his life, for Rubria and for Sarah ben Eleazar and for Iris, and so many that he cares for deeply in this world, and the beauty that they bring to his life. And they all point him back to the unknown God. As the story continues to develop, we see so many points where Lucanus is faced with the unknown God and resists. When he's handed the cross for the first time and given it, and to hold on to this cross, and he realizes that, oh my goodness, God is so big and so real, but I don't know if this is real. The star in the sky when Jesus is born that guides him and pulls him in, and he knows that something miraculous is happening, but he doesn't know what, and he's not sure why. But those experiences are deep in his heart and in his life. And then throughout his life, as he experiences miraculous happenings, he goes back to that moment when he saw the star in the sky. He goes back to that cross that he holds in his hands, and he realized that God is doing a work in him. Now, there's no way in this short video that I'm going to be able to go through this entire book, and I know that you have read it, so I'm just going to hit on a few high points that stood out to me personally, but I wish that we were in person so we could discuss this and have questions asked and talk about it together. But if you have questions, I do invite you to call me or reach out to me via email, and we can talk more in depth about this book. But it's a long book with 3 different parts that really goes into Lucanus's early life. And then once he grows and he becomes a physician, and his life as a physician and the miraculous things that he experiences. And then in part 3 goes into really how he discovers his eyes are open to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ, and then how he commits the rest of his time to discovering Christ through different people's eyes and different people's experiences. And so each of the different parts are fascinating, filled with a lot of imagery. Taylor Caldwell really sets the scene and describes the countryside and describes the cities and the towns. You can almost smell it when you're in Rome. You can almost smell it and feel it when you go into Judea, and when Lucanus goes into all those different places. And so she's a very descriptive writer. And I find that was, I was enchanted by the different scenery from when he visits Caesar and all of the the festivities there, and the wine and the drinks, just the revelry there, and then all the different ways that he seeks after those who have met Christ, and he walks in the places that Christ has walked, yet he never met him. Because this was a few years after even Jesus died and was resurrected that he really starts to engage and begins to write his gospel. So again, the book is very, very long and lots to talk about. I could go on and on, but I won't, because there's too much to talk about. So I'm just going to point out a few really powerful things that stood out to me, and then end with just sort of a overarching overview of kind of what I thought of this book. So as we continue, again, a lot to discuss, but some really cool things that I want to highlight. Let's see. So many times, Lukanus is, as he becomes a physician and as he leaves his home and grows up and is trained in Alexandria. And then this whole second part of the book was really fascinating to me, because Lukanus is this physician and he's healing people. And there's a theme throughout Lukanus's time where he's really interested in the fact that all men are equal. And whether they're slaves, and as he said as a young boy, he even said this, slaves or Caesars, or Romans or Greeks, Jews or Greeks, that all men are men and should be treated as so, and should be dealt with as so, and should have health care as so. And so it's fascinating to see that he advocated that all humans are created equal. And he ran up to some people on that didn't understand and laughed in his face and said, how could you treat these slaves as humans? They're just slaves in the bottom of the boat dying from a plague. How can you treat them this way? And Lukanus had a passion for people, and he knew from a young age that all people deserved humanity, the same kind of human treatment that he got. So he advocated for men. And on page 230, he says, I love this situation. And he was on this boat, and he was asked, or he was told that there was a plague, and there was some slaves, or he was seeing them being thrown over the side of the ship, these men that were dying, and he wanted to help, and he's the physician, and he said, I'm going to help. But of course he was of the upper class, and he couldn't go down there. And he says to the captain, he says, you do not understand me, said Lukanus, trying to keep his voice quiet. To me, as a physician, a slave is a man, a human being, capable of suffering as fiercely as a Caesar. A criminal, a felon, a murderer are also men. They are not apart from us in their humanity. Wow. And that is not the only time he said things along this nature. There were many times. In fact, he bought 2 slaves for himself in order so that he could free them and then have them work for him. Ramos and Samos, who turned out to be the sister of Sarah ben Elazar, Ariah, whom he'd been searching for his whole life. He found him, which was another point to that God was working in his life. He valued human life, and he knew in his deepest soul that God was a God of all people. And now we know, that's what Paul writes about in Galatians, is we know that there's neither slave nor Jew nor Greek nor man nor woman. All are in the sight of, all are saved by Christ. And Lukanus knew this. Even before he was opening his eyes to God, he knew, and he advocated for all men. And we see this theme throughout the book, that he continued to serve even the most dirty, even the leprous men, even all the people, slaves and free, and even Caesar. And he gave medical aid to Caesar in the same way that he gave medical aid to the leper in the street. It's fascinating to see how Lukanus really, really valued life. He valued life just as our God values life. I love the story of when he heals the leper. The leper and his wife running through the dark of night, escaping people searching after him, and he protects them and he hides them. And he just has this moment where he cries out to God in angst, saying, if you're not going to save this person, then what are we going to do here? And he puts his hand on the man who's a leper, and this crazy power comes out of him, and they're miraculously healed. Miraculously healed. The leper is no longer a leper. I find it incredibly fascinating that God used him in this way, and every time that happened, there would be a part of him that would go, wait a minute, what's just happened here? And how am I being used by God? Other times when not only on the ship, when there was a plague and he went down into the bowels of the ship when people were so sick, and he covered himself and he went down to try to offer some sort of help. And when he was down there, he realized, oh my goodness, this plague is so bad. And he gave people medicine as they could, and he knew they were going to lose many more. And then the next day they said, oh my goodness, all these people are healed. What happened? What happened? Must have been God. Must have, been some miraculous healing. And of course, Lukanus tries to rationalize this and say, well, wait a minute. No, I don't think, I must have been wrong. It must not have been a plague. Several times Caldwell illustrates throughout this book that Lukanus sort of tries to rationalize a miraculous thing that happens by reason and explain it away by science, because again, he was an educated man, educated by science and in the way of a physician, and it couldn't possibly be miracles. Lukanus must have been wrong, is what he keeps telling himself, and he tells other people, instead of embracing the power of the Almighty, embracing the power of God working among these people. Even when near the end of the book, when Lukanus stops on the side of the road when there's a funeral procession going on, and he stops and he says, who are you burying? And it was a woman who'd died in childbirth, and the sad dad and the sad husband, and they opened the casket, and he said, oh, she's not dead, she's only sleeping, and she comes back to life again. Power comes out of him, and he's like, I'm not God. I know I'm not God. How is this happening? And again, his eyes are opened then to the miraculous power of the Almighty. And he remembers the star in the sky, and he remembers the cross in his hand. I want to talk a little bit about the way that he begins to write his gospel. So the night that Jesus died on the cross, the whole world went dark, and Caldwell describes that so well about how is it a dust storm, and science and astronomy are trying to just, reason it away. But after they realized it was the night that Jesus died and was on the cross, and then Lukanus does his research and starts to understand what had happened, and he's talking to all these people, and he's realizing the power of God to do this work for his son to die on the cross and to literally die, and then the resurrection happens, and all the different people that are sick and come to life after that and have these visions, and all these, and he himself has these visions, and he thinks he's sick, but really, in fact, it's God working in and through him. But as Lukanus discovers the different stories about Jesus, he's on a scavenger hunt. He's on a journey. He really is on a journey to find this truth about this Messias, this Messiah. And his eyes are finally open, and he believes. I love page 407. Caldwell writes, and this is Lukanus speaking. I have many explanations, Lukanus began to think. This is kind of after the darkness came the night that Jesus died. He says, I have many explanations, Lukanus began to think. Then he paused, struck. Must I always rationalize? He thought suddenly. Must I always rush in a frenzy to explain things in the light of reason? What has my reason brought me but sorrow? Yet anything that is not logical to me is disgusting, childish, even profane. Without knowing why, he began to weep. When I read that in this book, I had a pause. I took a moment to realize that as human beings, as educated, as smart people with our own brains to think, I took a pause and I realized, wow, how it just hit me so powerfully What has my reason brought me but sorrow? When I try to rationalize so many things in my life, when I try to rationalize the good works that God is doing in my life, I only end up with sorrow. But when I embrace the power of the Almighty, it's amazing the way that my mind shifts. He even says this Jewish teacher must be a sort of physician who had known that the man was not really dead. Wow. This Jewish teacher that then he commits his life to figuring out and following. I think that as human beings, this is a powerful moment to stop and say, how many times do we as humans try to rationalize even just theology, the Bible, unexplainable things like some of the miracles that happen in our everyday life, but also some of the miracles that happen in Scripture that we read. And when we give ourselves over to the Almighty and when we trust God to do things, just like Lukanus did, I mean, he tried to rationalize, but it only brought him sorrow. It only brought him sorrow. And then he really, his eyes were really open to find Jesus. So then throughout the rest of the book, he really goes on to talk about, he sits, I love the part when he sits with his brother, a Roman soldier, his brother born to, Diodorus, his stepdad, and his deceased, Diodorus' deceased wife, Aurelia, she died in childbirth with Priscus, their son. And the son was almost dead, or this is early on in the book, the son was almost dead. And Lucanus, as a physician, a new physician in training, brought Priscus back to life. Again, an act of God more than an act of Lucanus. And so Priscus grows up, and long later, he's not well, and he's on his deathbed, and Lucanus goes to visit him, and Priscus, literally on his last breaths, almost, what seems to be his last breaths, is telling Lucanus' story about how he, as a Roman soldier, was at the cross, at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and Priscus tells this elaborate story about how this Jewish man, this Jewish leader that they all claim is this Messiah, carried his cross, and how women were weeping, and the mother of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there, and how he was hanging on the cross, and it was from the perspective of this Roman soldier, Lucanus' brother. And Lucanus is rapturely listening to Priscus tell this amazing story about how he saw the world go dark, and he heard Jesus' words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And here's this Roman soldier sitting there feeling so convicted by this Christ on the cross. And he tells of the other two beside him that were dying, beside Christ that were dying, and of the other soldiers and of the people weeping, and all the different stories. Of course, this is what we know from the Gospel of Luke as followers of Christ, but to hear it in this context from this Roman soldier is absolutely fascinating. So that makes it into Lukanus' gospel. So that's one perspective we gain about Jesus Christ. But then Lucanus' goal is to find Mary, find the mother of Jesus, because he can't imagine the virgin who carried the Christ in her belly, in her womb. And he is so adamant about finding her and meeting her and hearing her perspective on who Jesus Christ is. And so he does. He finds her, and he hears from her story about Jesus and her life raising him as a young boy and a carpenter and all the different things. And so we see these different perspectives that Lucanus gains as he puts together his gospel, and he sees the different ways. And we hear about when the day went dark, and we hear about when Jesus again appeared to his disciples and people were in awe. And we hear all of these stories that we know and we've heard about for so many years. And now we're seeing it, Caldwell puts it into this context. It's fascinating to learn about how Luke comes to this. One thing I forgot to mention about Priscus, after he tells Lucanus about this whole story about the cross and all these different things, the next day he says to and let me find it here, he says to Lucanus, he's like, I feel like I was being punished now. He's sick, excuse me, How could God, he says, I'm condemned. I knew that he had condemned me to death for my part in his execution. This is Prichard saying, my part in his execution as a Roman soldier, I'm condemned to death. And again, he's sick. He's on his deathbed. He's telling this story. But Lukanus smiled joyfully and placed his palm against his brother's gray and shriveled cheek. This is on page 464. No, he exclaimed. How could God condemn you? It was prophesied from the ages that he would die in that manner for the salvation of all men, and not only for the Jews. Not only for the Jews, for the salvation of all men, and not only for the Jews. I have known it always. Did he hate you? No, he loved you. You have spoken of his compassionate glance on you and his understanding. He wishes you to come closer to him and rest in his heart and be one with him. Listen, I tell you, he loves you and is with you always. Wow. Wow. Here is this Roman soldier who was supposed to keep guard while the Christ is hanging on the cross. And he's sure the fact that he's sick because he's condemned. He's sure that he's been condemned by God because he was part of his execution, of Jesus Christ's execution. And Lukanus preaches the gospel to Prichard. Preaches the gospel. He loves you. Oh, what grace we have in Christ Jesus, that when we crucify Jesus Christ, we deserve death, but Jesus took on that death for us. This is the gospel message. You have spoken of his compassionate glance on you, his understanding. He wishes you to come closer to him. Oh, how many of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God? How many of us have turned our backs on God and choose sin over choosing following God? And God pulls us back to him, tells us that he loves us and that he's with us always. Wow. Goes on to say here, Prichard's sunken eyes brightened. He leaned his cheek against Lucanus's hand. Tears slipped along his eyelids. Is it true? He urged. Is it true? And then Lukanus says, yes, it is true, and he is risen. Oh, truly, he is risen. And Prichard asks, and he was surely God? And Lukanus responds, he is surely God. Lukanus bent forward and kissed his brother's forehead. Their eyes were close together, the dark and the blue. Lukanus smiled lovingly and with strength. Wow. Prichard murmured, nestled his withered body closer to his brother, and suddenly slept in utter exhaustion. He appeared not to breathe. An expression of peace and contentment settled over his dying features. He was like one who has come home after a terrible journey, which has been filled with threatening monsters. He was like one who had been exiled to the fiery desert and then been summoned to return. And Lukanus clasped his hands together. Oh, you have brought me from the waste places and the darkness and the barrenness out of your love and your eternal mercy. Oh, you who are compassionate beyond imagining, you have haunted my life to bring me to you. Again, he's talking to God. Oh, you who know the sufferings of men because you have suffered them. Jesus Christ knows the sufferings of men because you have suffered them. Oh, hallowed are you in my soul, and I implore that you will accept my life, that I may serve you. Always have I loved you, even when I contended with you out of my lack of understanding. Be merciful to me, a sinner, a man without importance. Hear my voice that calls to you. Be pitiful to my poor brother, who was granted the merit of seeing you in our flesh. He loves you, and he knows you. Bring him peace. Bring him peace. Bring him surcease of pain. If he must die, then grant him a quiet death without anguish. So it goes on. I won't continue reading. It's just so good I can't stop. But it goes on, and the next day, when Lukanus visits, Prichard is sitting up. He's strong, and he's healthy, and he feels better. It's amazing. I have heard, and he says, let's see. He's risen. Blessed is his name. Amazing, amazing miracles that continue to happen over and over again. Amazing. God has mercy on us. And this story, Caldwell illustrates so well the gospel of Jesus Christ through this historical fictional story about St. Luke. And it's amazing how God called him from a young age and drew him to him through his life. And even though he fought it, his eyes were opened and he saw the miraculous power of Jesus Christ to heal and to change lives and to change hearts, to change his own heart. And then when he discovers Mary and he tells her story so beautifully. One more part I want to read on page 492. Lukanus says, once I was without hope. The world was utterly corrupt and without God. I lived in bitterness and despair. But as my brother Prichard has said to me, a revelation has been given to man by God, and never will the world be the same again. Never will the world be the same again. Hope and joy have been bestowed upon it. A new age has arisen, full of portent. I am called upon to help it increase and to bring the good tidings of all I meet. And that's our call, right? That's what Lukanus did. Throughout his life, he encountered God in many ways. His eyes were finally opened, and then he made it his mission to discover who Jesus was through the eyes of many, even though he himself didn't meet him. And then his goal in life is to continue to share that good news with people around him. And isn't that our call as Christians? Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Making disciples, sharing this good news with the world. When we read this book, it's not just a good fiction book, which it is, and Taylor Caldwell does an excellent job descriptively describing Lucanus's life and the relationships that he has, and the loss and the grief and the love and the despair and the hope that he has in Christ Jesus when he discovers him. So for us, as the overview, as the final statement that I'll make is, let us be like Lukanus. Let us be wide-eyed in awe of all that God has done in our lives. And let us not stop sharing this good news with the world, making sure that everybody knows that he is risen. He is risen. The world is dark no more. We don't have to be stuck in this bitterness, in this despair, in the agony of this world. But we have hope in the living Christ. He's real, friends. Let us share this good news with those around us. Thank you for participating with me in this story. I hope you enjoyed this book as much as I did. There's so much more I could say, and I would want to, but time is short and I don't want to take up too much of your time. So call me, write me. Let's have a conversation as we can talk more about this powerful story and as it points us to the truth that we know in Jesus, in God's word. About Jesus Christ. And now, as you read the Gospel of Luke, I hope your eyes are open to a new way of understanding Luke's Gospel. Bye, friends. Thank you so much. Have a good day.